Hey, I'm Brandon.
Hey, and I'm Greg.
This is Upon Further Inspection. We got Clay White with us today.
What motivates me, what always motivated me was to, try to improve our industry and avoid the failures. I went to work every day telling myself that lives matter based on decisions. I tried to bring to Phillips and from a corporate role and programs that we were basing on how we choose to approach the problems. And so I thought of it as life and death every day. And it is for some, and fortunately it's not often.
It can be.
It certainly can be. And so you got to always have that in your back of your brain when you're making these kind of calls.
Where do you think that comes from, that thought process? Was there an event? Was there something that happened back in the day, or an experience or something that has led you to that?
No, I didn't have, I call it you call it getting religion or having a come to Jesus moment or whatever. I didn't really have one of those major type of events that affected me personally, although early on in my career, probably the one that shaped it the most, not having coming out of my original foray was the defense industry stuff. So we weren't looking at massive failures that could affect a lot of people. We had a Sumitomo process reactor for making polypropylene. And so it was a big stirred reactor, very large. I don't remember how many thousand gallons it was, it was 40 foot tall and 12-foot diameter, give or take, of liquid propane in it, right? So we had started, this is literally about 2 weeks after I started the job, a guy went up to adjust a high level capacitance probe which told you when you were reaching or nearing the top of the drum for a liquid fill height. And he removed the cap. It's kind of looked like a distributor cap, if you will. He removed the cap off of this thing, and the capacitance probe, which is a long tube that goes down into the vessel, launched out. In fact, he got it partially unscrewed, and the 500 pounds of pressure blew it out of his hand. And we had a huge release of liquid propane turning, to gas.
Wow.
And I don't remember how big that lease was, 8,000 pounds before they got it de-inventoried and stuff. Fortunately, it was the top of the reactor. So, we had wind on our side and there was not any kind of ignition source. So it never lit off. And there was only one guy near there. And that probably impacted me more than anything else in terms of thinking how dangerous this could be. Now, that wasn't a mechanical integrity failure per se. What it turned out was that the capacitance probe had a plate that held down. They had machined a groove. So you had these keepers, these little moon clip things that went around the probe, and then it had a plate that screwed that down and tightened it down, but you were dependent upon those keepers. And
like a distributor cap.
Kind of like a distributor cap. And what they had done is they rebuilt those probes and they failed to put those keepers in. And so there was nothing literally other than friction, a bit of a friction fit from that collar around it that held it in place, and it had launched out. And they were talking about shutting down the whole plant, and because they had 4 more reactors with those exact two of those probes on each top of each of those reactors. And I looked at it and I said, I don't think you need to shut down, but we need to x-ray all of them immediately to see if those keepers are in place, right? Because we had enough room around them to x-ray it. And we actually, from x-raying it, we found I think 2 others that were missing the keepers.
Wow.
So the rebuild shop, when it went out, whoever rebuilt it didn't have the right kind of level of quality control to do that. So I guess that's as close as I've got, Brandon, as a incident. Of course, I've also been on fatality investigations and other incident investigations. So I've seen lots of them, a couple burn throughs on hot tapping and other problems. So there's been lots of little reminders, obviously, how serious our industry can be. And I always said, for when I was talking with the sites about, you don't want to have a religious experience to get religion. You want to learn from the mistakes of others. And, as Greg knows, because he's seen lots of stuff I've talked about, I often start presentations with the big fireball picture, like Reynolds does the same thing a lot, right? We show in fact, we did that whole series, right, for AFPM around, what can happen. I forgot what we called that one, but it was just a series of learnings from significant mistakes and stuff. So that's kind of what's always in my head when I'm thinking about these programs.
You mentioned that as in some of your different roles, you were doing a lot of looking at the data, the models, the failure reports, all of those. Your conversation brings me to this. Did you find that a lot of the failures that you have gone back and investigations you've looked at have been failures on the part of data input and execution on the back end? Or have you seen that there actually have been lapses in the technologies that people are using, whether it's inspection technologies, whether it's MI related technology? Have you seen that it's the technologies, or have you seen that it's maybe more user error or constraints on the back end?
Well, I've seen all of those, but I guess if the question is more around what do you see the most of, or what seems to be more of the problem or issues, I would say it's probably a lot of it was more keyed to a failure to understand the limitations on the approach you were taking. So in some cases, I think that applies to, we weren't looking in the right location with the right technique, right, for the damage, or you didn't understand how the software was really working or really calculating the risk. And so they missed something that would have adjusted or changed that risk assessment, or like in cases that we've just talked about on CML reduction kind of efforts, that they didn't realize that they didn't have the right inspection data, or they had too little of the inspection data to actually formulate a statistical analysis around. So it gave them, a false sense of security, and said you could reduce the CMLs down to, 1 or 2, right? So it's almost inevitably kind of more of a human factors issue and failure to consider everything that needs to be done, more than it is a specific technology issue. I think, you can, if you understand the limitations on the software you're employing or the technology you're employing, then you always can come up with a way around it, right? I mean, no RBI program, for an example, no RBI program covers every type of damage mechanism. And it certainly doesn't cover it well, right? So we have damage mechanisms that are very difficult to try to predict. So take HTHA for an example, right? So is the HTHA model not great in everybody's RBI? That's probably true. But, knowing that, especially as an owner user, it's incumbent upon you to understand what those limitations are, and
Exactly.
and overcome them. However you have to do it. Do I put a more comprehensive inspection plan in place because I know I can't predict HTHA particularly well? Absolutely. Should I be more conservative on operation? Absolutely. All of those things apply, right? But you have to understand it in order to come to those kind of conclusions and create a program that compensates for it.
Clay, I'll share a story, and Brandon, you may find this hard to believe, but I remember back in the late 80s when I was consulting with owner operators on their inspection programs, I'd say, well, what are you going to do about this weld? They go, oh, we got UT examiners. They're going to come and examine that weld. And I said, well, do they understand what they're looking for? And they looked at me like deer in the headlights. Yeah, they're looking for cracks. I'm like, well, are those cracks going to be parallel to the weld or transverse to the weld? What kind of cracks are we talking about? Because that makes a difference in how they inspect. They had no idea. They were sending UT guys out there, and they didn't know if they were pushing their probes in the right direction. And the other thing they didn't do is they'd have people come out, and back then, remember, manually, we were using EPRI flaw sizing method.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't have the time of flight diffraction yet, and some of this other stuff. And the owner operators, most of them were, like you said, they didn't understand the limitations and the things you need to do this right.
Well, I don't know that we are, right? So like your example's a great one, Greg, because, you think about how, what we have to work with. And this is no comment on the current state of quality of people in our joining our industry or coming out of school or whatever. But, if you're fairly fresh out of school as a mechanical engineer and they throw you at the MI department, right? What do you really know about the limitations on inspection technology?
Nothing.
They don't teach that in school. Maybe maybe they do now. I don't know, but I've
A
never.
few places.
Yeah, I've not come across anybody up front that really understood the limitations on the inspection technology side. And having somebody that really understands that is critical, I think, in your company, right? So, instead of just saying, I need you to go look for corrosion here, or I need you to inspect. I mean, if you go up even a higher level, I need you to inspect this vessel. Well,
Yep.
what am I looking for? Where am I looking?
Yep.
What damage am I looking
Exactly.
for? So the inspector, they're dependent upon the inspector to try to ask those questions if they don't know, or if it's not detailed out on a specific equipment inspection plan, right? That's a very true statement for today, even, I think.
If you were in charge of operating and running Clay White's refinery, then what 3 high-level best practices would you make sure that your team's implemented?
Well, to me, just because of my background, I think, from a corrosion standpoint, you have to understand the problem to find it, right? And compensate for it. So doing a really good damage mechanism review on the equipment in the unit or the plant, I think is critical. Everything kind of stems from that. If you think about it, right? It's the starting point for doing IOWs. It's the starting point for doing good CML reviews and optimizations, the starting point for RBI. So much is dependent upon doing that, or developing your CCDs. All 4 of those things in common have the DMR as your starting point. So that's key.
Let me ask for one more clarification on that one. For
Yeah.
you, a really good DMR includes what?
Well, number one, you've got to understand the design, the operation, and some of the history, right? So you need to go back at least in history to review kind of what's happened in the past. You don't want to ignore that piece of it, because whoever's running or inspecting the unit today doesn't necessarily know that. He may not have refreshed his view of it, from previous RBIs or previous DMRs, or from failures that have occurred way in the past. So I try to get as much history as I can out of that. You write a summary. I used to have my inspectors go back and pull all the history they could and write that. So it ended up being about a page of history from operational considerations, when those changed, repairs, modifications, whether or not it was post-fault heat treated after they did the mods, all of that kind of stuff. And if they had corrosion failures or cracking related failures, and how they've inspected it, what were they looking for, right? So that's really, I think, a key. So that's understanding and getting a good DMR, which would include not only the damage mechanism, but the strategy really of where do I need to be inspecting and why do I need to be inspecting this equipment, and just, I think, how often I need to inspect, that needs to be tied to other things, but not just rate, but how you're operating too. So you need to fold in the IOW side of that equation to make sure that you're adjusting when you see kind of changes there as well on the timing, either updating your RBI or approach, or you just go back out and re-inspect it preventatively if you see a significant change or another related event. That's the start of a good DMR, is identifying those factors. I'm not talking about an overall CCD approach, but once you get through the DMR, now you're looking at my strategy. Where am I going to inspect? What tools am I going to use? Where, how often do I need to do it again? And that's tied to a couple of things. That's the key, aligning your strategy to what your DMR is telling you. If you think about historically, right? So back in the day, we had typically a fixed intervals, right, for inspection. So you look at early versions of our inspection codes document, they were essentially fixed interval type inspections. And then we went to more of a condition based inspection. So we would calculate a half-life and we would re-inspect on what the anticipated condition of the equipment is. Then we've gone to risk-based inspection, right? So now we're looking at multiple factors and deciding how much and when to inspect the equipment. What level of inspection quality do I need to apply to that? So that evolution is continuing, right? Because risk-based inspection goes back to 93. So what's our next level of evolution? Is it an AI approach? Maybe, probably. That's coming. But if you think about what we've changed in that time frame, we didn't talk about doing DMRs, back when we first started RBI, not to the degree that we do now. We didn't have IOWs or CCDs. Now that those things have continued to push us from a much more prescriptive, then reactive, right? Then predictive, we're now continuing to push forward in the predictive modeling of damage in order to make sure we apply the right inspection. That's kind of the evolution as I see it for the MI world.
What are the next two then best practices beyond the DMR?
But beyond the DMR, so then, obviously I think the key after the DMR is doing the alignment with your inspection strategy, right? You've got
okay.
That's to me, that's something that's being missed a lot more often than I would like to see, right? So lots of audits that I've done, they never really relocated or adjusted their CMLs or essentially the inspection techniques or strategy for it, right? So I think that's the second next step after that. And then of course, I think you want to plug it into, I'm a huge believer in RBI, but again, you've got to be mindful of the things that it doesn't do particularly well. External corrosion's an issue, right? So HCHA, all some different types of damage have to be compensated for in different ways. And then ultimately you have to tie this all together to and make sure that your MI program is dependent upon how the unit's being currently operated and changes that are being anticipated in operation, right? And so that ties you back to understanding, when the process engineer puts in an MOC to make a change, right? You need to be tied into that MOC process, and you certainly need to be tracking and monitoring any kind of the integrity operating windows changes. When you trigger one of those, you've got to make sure that you're appropriately responding with your inspection plan. That may not change your inspection plan, but a lot of times it might because of changes that you've documented through either an MOC or an IOW that are coming.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said that. The IOW, integrity operating windows, the CCD, the corrosion control document, and then MOC, your management of change process. So
having those work together is critical. The other thing I will tell you that I'm a huge believer in that's part of this is kind of tracking your failures and understanding your failures. One of my favorite ways to do audits is I'll pull a plant's past 2 years of failures, and you do kind of a reverse engineering approach and look at how did you miss this, right? Those are often the most telling in terms of where you have gaps in your program and what you're not doing well at a given site, right? So you may see, even when you start to see repeated failures or the repeated kind of a common theme on how things were missed. So, running metrics, making sure the metrics mean something, right? Understanding you got to catch enough data on a leak metric to make sure that you can actually use it to help you design a program to understand what you missed and improve the program, right? So you've got to be intentional about the leak metric, not that it just leaked. Yeah. What was the damage?
What'd you learn
How
from
did you
it?
miss it? Why'd you miss this? How'd you fail to predict this? Every leak is an opportunity, right, to improve in terms of what you missed. And so that's kind of the approach I took. I think our leak metric had about 30 different things that we captured on a given leak metric. Was it localized? Was it generalized? Where did it occur specifically? What was the closest inspection location? What was our inspection strategy? How did we miss that? Right? That kind of thing. And then analyzing that data, annually at least, right? Looking back and saying, okay, what else new happened that I need to respond to, or maybe need to consider a change in our program. So doing that resulted in modifications of the Phillips standards that we had. So going back and looking, we retooled our external corrosion program completely after, seeing kind of the preponderance of data showing that we were not capturing.
with your consulting hat on, with all of the audits that you have done, have you seen some systemic misses throughout, not just one company, but across everything that you've been looking at? Is there anything systemic in industry that you're seeing people are missing?
Yeah. The one I've missed, I've got two key ones. I think the one I've already mentioned is that people are not rethinking their strategy after doing a DMR. There's no follow-on to a DMR in a lot of cases, or they didn't particularly do a good DMR because they still were missing kind of key damage and had really created the right inspection strategy relative to that damage mechanism. I've seen that at a lot of sites in a lot of different companies. It seems to be fairly universal, and I can't predict why, other than the fact that it still takes some corrosion materials engineering help, and it's tedious. You got to go back through all your individual circuits and piping and detailed look at where you're inspecting. Less of an issue, obviously, on vessels because you're getting in the vessel periodically, typically. So you'll see or find the damage internally. And so you can adjust your inspection program. It's a big issue on pipe. So that's certainly one of them. The other one I want to mention is maybe not directly related to your question. I guess it is, but there have been a lot of sites that through a change or an acquisition, or maybe they get a new lead and MI come in, they want to make a systemic change in their IDMS program. And I've got to tell you, from audits that I've done, that is probably by far the most detrimental thing you can do to a plant system. It almost doesn't even matter nearly as much what program it is. Just the fact that you're making a change, and then you're going to have to map all this data over into a new program, and how you map that data. And it's going to ask for new data that you don't have, or you change your risk basis for how you're doing your calculations. It throws everything into a blender, essentially, right? And causes all kinds of problems. I'll give you an example I came across here fairly recently. A site had just changed over. They were using API RBI, and I think it was PCMS for their standard IDMS program. But so what they did is they changed. A couple of the sites were on a different IDMS program, and they wanted everybody to be on the same program. So they said everybody's going to change, I think, to PCMS, and we're going to use PCMS RBI, not API RBI. So what they did is they took the previous RBI assessment that was done 3 to 5 years ago, and they carried over those dates as a fixed date in the new program. So they wanted to make use of the RBI analysis that they previously done, even though it was on a different RBI basis. They brought that over as a fixed date. Well, when they plugged it into the way they plugged it into PCMS as a fixed date, it actually invalidated, or it failed to consider any of the other data that would be related to corrosion rate or risk. Since you turned on a fixed date, that was a user override.
Yeah.
So they continued to inspect for three plus years after that conversion, but they weren't due to do an internal on this tower for another 2 years at their next turnaround interval, I think, is the way it went. But they actually corroded through and failed that tower and had a pretty substantial leak from that. But their data was showing them that they had increased the corrosion rate to 17 mils a year, but because they had overridden user override on the inspection date, it wasn't actually calculating or considering any of the new corrosion date. And they did that for every vessel in the plant that had an RBI study. So that was just happened to be the first failure that occurred from it.
That's a really standard practice that I've seen is
too.
grandfathering in that old
Right.
date. And then,
Right.
okay, once we get to that, then we'll move forward with the new.
Yeah, then we'll restart the clock and do it
Yeah.
the new way and rerun the risk or whatever. Huge mistake on that.
Wow.
So it's
Well, that plays into what you said, right? Understanding the limitations of
Right.
the program, the
Program.
process, the procedure, whatever, understanding those limitations. And
right.
when you completely switch your IDMS or your methodology of RBI,
Yeah,
I mean, it compounds.
it's huge.
very
It's
quickly.
it's huge. If you think about it, you've got to move every piece of data in there. Notwithstanding the millions of CML readings that you've got as a historical archive, just in RBI alone, I think back in the day, 35 sticks in my head, but I know it's more now, but we had 35 pieces of discrete data to run an API RBI calculation for risk. It's more now, right? When you think about all of that data for each piece of equipment that's got to be mapped over into the right location, from that update, understanding that if I do overrides, that may invalidate other things. I mean, there's so many nuances to doing this well.
And it may not be a one-to-one, right?
Exactly.
It may
exactly.
not be
You're
a
missing
perfect
data.
one-to-one, especially
Right.
going from like API RBI to the PCMS RBI.
Right.
There's fields that don't match up. So what do you do?
That's right.
Do you keep it as a record and you put it into a different field and everybody just knows this field means this?
What'd you do for a quality control when you map the data from one location to the other in a back end dump that was some computer guy did it for you, right? I mean, you've got to check all that data.
So this is for Clay, for you and Brandon both, because I know you've both been in this, but this is your interview. But here's the question is, how do you think the industry can do a better job when they're evaluating whether or not they should change platforms? And then if they decide, yeah, the juice is worth the squeeze, they do a good job of it, that they anticipate things, that they roll it out, that they set themselves up for success and sustainability. What does the industry have to do to improve that? Because I don't think they do it well either.
No, it's disastrous. Brandon, I'll let you go first.
It seems to me that they make sure they call Clay White. That seems pretty straightforward there.
I am no PCMS or data mapping expert. I've lived through this multiple times personally, of course.
Yeah, yeah. My knee jerk is, make sure that you have people that understand what they're doing, participating in the process. Whether it's somebody that you have internally or externally, like, don't be too proud to go and get help and have somebody there available. Greg, you mentioned before, if you have techies doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing. And Clay, you said you got programmers moving data over, but what you're missing there is that context of all the data, that understanding, that MI piece. So I think one of the big pieces, and by the way, I can't tell you how many times we get phone calls of, hey, we're going to do RBI. Oh, cool. Okay. So you're going to do vessels? Oh yeah, we're going to do everything. Vessels, circuits, piping, PRDs, tanks, whole thing. Yeah, right. And you're like, oh, okay. Have you circuitized? Do you have circuits? What do we need those for? Okay. Yeah. Understood. I get that. Right. So like, and so these are like conversations where you kind of have to work your way through it. And, oh, we want to do PRDs. Okay, cool. Do you understand what happens when you do PRDs? That you're going to have some that you're going to be able to extend, and the ones that you don't want to extend, or the ones that you do want to extend that are the hardest ones to get to, they're not going to extend out. Those are the ones that are always going to be high risk, and that plan is going to backfire on you. And so for me, it's having people who understand the technology that you want to bring in, the concepts, the ideas, having that MI person, again, internal or external, available to be able to help support your journey. I think that's one of the most important things you can do.
Yeah. My first advice is don't do it. My second advice is the same as my first. And then my third piece would be, if you absolutely have to do it, develop a plan. And the plan needs to be detailed enough that you've considered all of those things. Checks, what am I giving up if I go this route? How do I migrate all this data? And how am I going to quality check it? And how am I going to fill in the gaps that are existing? What are the gaps that are existing? What are the advantages, disadvantages of my new program? What am I going to have to compensate for, right? I've never seen anybody develop a plan to do this. Yeah. At Philips, when I started the job, I inherited 3 different IDMS programs. And so I think it was Credo Soft, maybe. And then we had the old Berwanger program. And then we had, it was probably
Ultrapipe.
Ultrapipe before Berwanger bought it later, I think. And then we had PCMS. So we decided we're going to put everybody on the same platform. We evaluated the pros and cons of each of the programs, and then kind of decided to go forward with PCMS. We weren't doing RBI at the time. A couple select sites was doing RBI at the time, but they were kind of standalone, I think, mostly E2G programs. The way I approached it was, I knew I wanted everything to map into PCMS. So I went straight to PCMS and said, I need a guy with a lot of corrosion or an inspection experience in PCMS. I want him to do it. That's how I met Joe Chamet. And so Joe and I spent lots of time talking about it. We didn't actually develop a map, but I kind of counted on Joe to know the ins and outs and the problems. And the contractor's there to help you, and they'll help you in any way they can, but you got to make sure they understand that software and program and the issues. I think nobody anticipated that at Case I showed you where nobody was thinking through what happens. They didn't understand PCMS well enough to understand that when they migrated that data, the RBI data, and used a fixed state, that it was going to invalidate all kinds of other considerations that PCMS normally would do for when you were seeing high corrosion rate. It's going to only go to that default, whatever you said was a user override date. Yeah. And there's lots of ways to mess up PCMS. Trust me, I've done it multiple times.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, Clay and Brandon. The one bit of advice I would give listeners is to make sure they engage someone who understands all those, I think, nuances between the two and what adjustments need to be made prior to making that transfer. It's not just as easy as hiring some body with a background in that programming in that software to do some massive data swap, because I'll guarantee you they don't know where all those nuanced technical areas are that are going to jack up the data.
The worst example on this that I came across recently was there was a company. I don't want to get in trouble with naming names, but there was a company that had a corporate homegrown IDMS program. There's not many of those, so you probably have a good idea who that might be. that site changed hands, and so it was incumbent upon them to switch over to PCMS. But they were never successful in mapping the data from the homegrown version of IDMS into PCMS. So when I actually did an audit of the plant, so I did an audit of the plant in 2 years after they pulled the plug on their old software. They were still using a one-off version of the old software to try to continue to manage the plant, but it was a stagnant version of that software, and they still had not transferred any of the data or much of the data at all. It was only a little bit of the data were they able to migrate. And they'd kind of given up and thought they were just going to have to go back through and redo everything by hand, which, think about that, they just added 10 years to the conversion process, right? So
Yeah, it subtracted 10 years from their lives. Too, probably.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and there were several other findings resulting from that on stuff that they had not been inspecting or not considered for updating.
Switching gears completely.
Okay.
Have you had a chance to do any type of brewing or distilling lately?
I haven't started distilling, but I brew kind of constantly. I always have something going. So yeah, the one I just finished was a batch of Belgian triple ale. I like the stronger Belgian ales. Yeah. Triples and quads or Belgian dark strong ales. That's what it is actually. So yeah, I really enjoyed doing it. I've been doing it now for a couple of years. So, and of course the engineer in me always wants to track everything. So I've got a whole spreadsheet that runs all my calc gravities, and it'll keep track of all of it, and I keep notes on it and stuff. So it's been kind of an enjoyable pastime. Right. Have you done some brewing, Brandon?
Back in the day, way back in the day. I think every male American at some point probably thought about it. Has done some version, whether it was in a bathtub or in an actual glass jar.
Well, if you've ever been to a distillery, man, you look at how they do those vats. The bathtub isn't any different. So yeah, I never started in a bathtub, but thank God I didn't develop this habit until late in life, because I was telling somebody the other day that if I knew how easy it was to brew stuff in college, I'd have been in real trouble.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Greg, anything else?
A million things, but we only have so much time, and I'm about worn out at this point.
Yeah, that was about 2 hours worth. I don't know if you condense it down into about 5 minutes of meaningful conversation. But the rest of it was interesting to me.
Thank you for listening to Upon Further Inspection, a mechanical integrity podcast. This episode was co-created by Inspectioneering and Core Solutions. Our producers are Nick Schmoyer, Jocelyn Christie, and Jeremiah Wood. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal or professional advice. Listeners should seek their own qualified advisors for guidance. If you enjoyed this episode, please join us next time wherever you listen to your podcast. Until then, stay safe and stay informed.